So we're back on the committee report. We turn now to our principal speaker of the day, and I should mention that our board host, who will have the privilege of asking the first question, is Dick Hutchison at the head table. It's very timely that at the meeting where we are acting upon the committee report on a human services policy for Oregon, we also have as a speaker one who is a recognized expert both on economics and on social welfare, and the interaction between the two. Mr. Reischauer is a senior fellow in the Economic Studies program of the Brookings Institution. He is an economist by training and has written extensively on economic and social issues. From 1970 to 1975, he was on the staff of Brookings Institution. He left Brookings in '75 to help set up the then new Congressional Budget Office. He then served for 5 years as Senior Vice President of the Urban Institute and returned to Brookings last year. And since I'm sure you're all wondering, he is the son of Edwin Reischauer, formerly ambassador to Japan. His particular interest today is in America's so-called underclass, and he comes to us today to discuss that subject under the title, 4 Questions in Search of Answers. Dr. Reischauer.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially if you come from an Arctic wonderland like Washington, D.C. It's always nice in the middle of the winter to get a chance to go to a tropical climate like Portland in January. When I left home yesterday morning, there were 28 inches of snow out in my front yard, and the road hadn't been plowed, and it was 5 degrees below zero, and I had 2 children who had missed 5.5 days of school straight and were going crazy. And the weather forecast at 6 a.m. was that it was supposed to snow again last night at rush hour. Unfortunately, my wife was asleep and didn't hear this, or she probably would have grabbed the plane tickets and my speech notes and have been standing here in front of you rather than myself.
Excuse me, you can raise this up if necessary and get a little more height there.
Oh, I can, if I get in trouble, I can hide behind this. Let's keep it right. Over the past few years, public concern has mounted over the disquieting possibility that underclass might be developing in this country, a class of people who are outside of the social and economic mainstream, a class of people who have no real significant stake in our system. This concern has been reflected in and fed by a good deal of media attention that's included the Bill Moyer special on the vanishing black family, a number of series of articles in newspapers like the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune, and feature stories in the Atlantic Monthly, The Economist, U.S. News and World Report, various other national magazines. The interest that the nation has showed in the underclass reflects both a genuine sense of concern and compassion about the downtrodden and some more basic and baser concerns. Most of America strongly believes that this should be a land of opportunity and that we should have a society in which classes are very weak and very fluid. We're therefore understandably upset about the possibility that a significant segment of our country may be denied the chance to better itself. But at the same time, many suspect that the underclass has contributed disproportionately to such national problems as crime, out-of-wedlock births, drugs, welfare dependency, and the plight of our cities. Some people also fear that an alienated segment of the population at some time in the future could be a source of social disruption. Propelled by these feelings of compassion and fear, pressure has begun to mount to do something about the underclass. Politicians are out groping around for an appropriate response. welfare reform, training and employment programs, and stringent enforcement of drug laws are just some of the policies that are being considered. Before we prematurely embrace one or two of these policies in the hopes that it might be the miracle cure that will somehow make the underclass disappear, it would be wise to stand back and ask ourselves four basic questions, questions that remain largely unanswered, although they are of critical importance if we intend to do something about this problem. These questions are, first, what do we really mean by the underclass? Secondly, how big is this problem? How many people are involved? Third, why at this particular juncture in our history does an underclass seem to be emerging? And finally, what constitutes an appropriate response to the problem? Let me start with the question of what do we mean by the underclass? Well, everybody's quite certain that something called an underclass is emerging in America. There really is no agreement on what the term actually means. For most people, it's just a series of images. It's an image of an unmarried teenage mother. It's the image of the long-term welfare recipients. It's the image of the high school dropout who's shooting baskets in the park. It's the mugger in the alley. It's the homeless bag lady wandering aimlessly through the city streets. The faces in these kinds of images, by and large, are black and Hispanic, and the backdrop is usually the decaying neighborhood of one of our large cities. But images, of course, aren't a definition. If we go to the dictionaries to look for a definition, we'll really come up short. If you bought your dictionary in the 1970s or before that, you probably won't even find the word underclass in it. If you have a more recent dictionary, the chances are what you'll find for a definition is the lower class. But certainly we mean something quite different when we're talking about the underclass today. The experts who have done research in this area really aren't a whole heck of a lot of help either. Each one, by and large, has developed his or her own definition, and there doesn't really exist a consensus or a single definition which everybody would adhere to. I've reviewed all this literature, and I'd like to propose to you a definition which involves 6 characteristics which somebody in the underclass should possess. First of these is obviously low income, not just being poor, but really being poor for a long period of time, a persistent, grinding form of poverty. Second attribute of the underclass would be a weak attachment to the labor force. Many of the persistently poor in this country work long hours, work full-time at low-wage jobs, and are contributing members of our economy and our society. Certainly it isn't these folks that we're talking about when we're talking about the underclass. It's really the able-bodied people who are unemployed or underemployed despite the availability of work opportunities around them. Third characteristic of the underclass would be a lack of education and skills. The functional illiterate, the kid who dropped out of high school and hasn't picked up some trade, these are the kinds of people that would meet this attribute. Fourth characteristic of the underclass is a sense of alienation from mainstream society, an alienation that tends to manifest itself in socially undesirable behavior. Now, this socially undesirable behavior might take the form of participation in the underground economy, criminal activity, fathering or bearing a child out of wedlock, long-term welfare dependency, things like that. Fifth characteristic of the underclass would be membership in a minority group that suffers discrimination in our society. For the most part, this means being black, Hispanic, or of Native American ancestry. And the final characteristic would be a person who resides in a neighborhood that contains a high concentration of individuals with social and economic problems. Having defined the underclass, let me now turn to the second question, which was, how big a problem is this? How big a population are we talking about? Unfortunately, we have only a very crude ability to measure the underclass? Well, we know how many people are poor, and we know how many people are lacking in education, we know how many aren't attached to the labor force or how many lived in depressed areas. We have very little information on the intersection of all of these characteristics. In addition, we have very little amount of data on the persistence of these types of conditions by people. We have snapshots. Who has these characteristics in a single year? Not any kind of good feel for how many people have these characteristics year after year after year. And finally, we lack information totally in this country on the attitudes and behavior of the population. Well, when we gather together all the scanty bits of evidence there are on our population and piece it together, the conclusion that one has to come up with is that a relatively small fraction of the population should be considered members of the underclass, a small fraction of the total population, and even a minority of the poor population in America. My own research, which has tried to combine these characteristics that I discussed before, given the limitations of the data, suggests that no more than 1.2% of the total population and no more than 9% of the poor in America possess the non-attitudinal characteristics that I have just described. If we had attitudinal information, my guess is that 1.2% and 9% would be cut rather drastically again. But on the other hand, the data sources which one has to use for this kind of analysis are inadequate because they undercount the homeless, they undercount the drifting teenage males, they undercount the people who don't really have a firm place of residence. And when one thinks about adding them back into your count, you might be back up to where I was before, 1 to 2% of the total population. Thus, the good news is that the size of the problem population is relatively small, although all of the indications that we have suggest that it's growing at a moderate rate. The bad news, of course, is that the numbers understate the seriousness or the intractability of the problem and the human suffering and social costs that are involved. Let me turn now to the third question, which is the rather perplexing one of why has an underclass begun to emerge in America at a time when racial discrimination in our society seems to be on the wane, when the growth in employment in our economy has been the envy of the industrialized world, and when educational opportunities have expanded at a fairly rapid pace. Truthful answer to this question is we really don't know with any degree of certainty. Nevertheless, I'd like to lay out for you 5 factors which I think have contributed the most to the emergence of the underclass. The first of these is the general weakness of the nation's economy. In part, the underclass is nothing more than the byproduct of our refusal to operate the economy at anywhere near its capacity. The period since 1973 has been, by a very wide margin, the weakest economic period that we have experienced since the Great Depression. In a persistently slack economy of this sort, many will find themselves jobless for prolonged periods of time. Those with the fewest marketable skills, those with the least education, those who are the most susceptible to discrimination, and those who live in areas with outmoded industrial structures are the ones who are most likely to bear the brunt of such an anemic economy. In short, it's the poorly educated minorities living in the nation's older cities that have been faced with the bleakest job prospects. Demographic pressures represent the second factor that has contributed to the emergence of the underclass. To a degree, the underclass represents the fallout from the increased competition that has developed for low-skilled, entry-level jobs in this country. There are 3 reasons why this competition has grown more fierce in the last few years, and those are the entrance of the baby boom generation into the labor force, the rising numbers of women who have chosen to enter the labor force, and the increase in the number of immigrants that we have absorbed in this country. The magnitudes of all 3 of these changes are rather amazing. If you look at the number of young people who entered the labor market in the 1976 to 85 period, the last 10 years basically, you find it's about 16 million people on average, which is 2.5 times the number of people in that age cohort who were in the economy in the 1950s. Our economy just had to do 2.5 times what it had to do during the 1950s on that score. If you look at what's happened to labor force participation of women, you find that just the increase in the participation rate has added over 11 million more workers to our labor force. And finally, with respect to immigrants, we've absorbed 5 million legal immigrants and probably something around 2 million undocumented workers into this country in the last decade, which represents the largest influx of immigrants that this country has experienced since the first 2 decades of this century. Now, some employers have preferred immigrants with their lower wage expectations and their willingness to tolerate poor working conditions. Others have preferred middle-class female labor force reentrants. The increase in this type of worker accounts for 1/3 of the jobs that have been created over the last 15 years, and immigrants have absorbed 1 out of 8 of the new jobs that have been created in our country. And some employers have preferred the baby boomers, who on average have had much higher educational attainment levels than the workforce before and have been very attractive. In short, with all these 3 groups pushing into the labor force, somebody's been pushed to the back of the queue, and the people that have been pushed to the back of the queue, I would argue, by and large, are the people with underclass characteristics. Structural changes in our economy represent the 3rd explanation for the emergence of the underclass. The advance of technology and the growth of the service sector seem to have left the nation with far more unskilled and uneducated workers than the economy needs. 30 years ago, a high school dropout in this country could look forward to some probability of finding a steady job that paid a decent wage at the steel plant, in the auto factory, in some kind of occupation that really required a strong back and some mechanical ability and a willingness to follow verbal instructions from your boss. But these types of jobs have been disappearing, as you're all well aware, in our economy, and they're being replaced by jobs that require an ability to follow written instructions, a capacity to communicate effectively with a customer, or a facility with basic arithmetic. And these seem to be skills that we aren't imparting to a significant fraction of our youth these days. 4th factor which has contributed to the recent emergence of the underclass is the deteriorating conditions of the low-income ghetto, which increasingly have come to isolate a segment of our population from the nation's social and economic mainstream. Half a century ago, the ghetto contained a mix of social and economic classes. The poor lived there, broken families lived there, dysfunctional people lived there, but so too did many working class families, many husband and wife families, and even some professionals. At that time, the ghetto contained many strong socializing institutions: churches, political machines, neighborhood organizations, fraternal organizations, and halfway decent public schools. Small businesses flourished at that time, and the streets were basically safe. The poor and the troubled growing up in those neighborhoods had middle-class families around them as role models. They lived next to stable families and came in contact constantly with adults who had strong attachment to the labor force. The environment, in short, was one in which traditional middle-class values dominated. But all this has changed. The civil rights revolution of the 1960s and 70s, together with the economic advances that were made in the 50s and 60s, have permitted many blacks who were in the working class and the middle class to escape from the worst neighborhoods of our inner cities. Because of this exodus, the ghettos have become home only to the poor and troubled families now. Socializing institutions and the economic base of these neighborhoods have begun to wither away, and the schools, which were once avenues or routes out of the ghetto and into the middle class, have deteriorated into training grounds for the hustlers. Faced with difficult family situations and few middle-class role models inadequate schools, and a lack of socializing institutions, those growing up in the ghetto have increasingly begun to develop into an underclass, I think. Final factor which has contributed to the emergence of the underclass is the economic alternatives that have been provided by drugs, by the underground economy, and the welfare system. Underclass has developed because some have found that the lifestyles that are offered by these alternative endeavors are more attractive than those offered by traditional forms of employment. For the young high school dropout, a life of dealing drugs or hustling a little on the street may look relatively appealing. It offers more free time, no hassle from some middle-class boss, more status around the neighborhood, and probably a bit more money than the low-wage, unstable, dirty job that this individual could obtain in the outside world. Similarly, some young women may rationally regard welfare with its built-in health insurance and unlimited leisure as preferable to working in a menial minimum wage job which offers no health insurance, no vacation, no sick leave, which means that you have to commute an hour to the job and an hour back. You have to make some kind of daycare arrangements for your child. Welfare is a better alternative than that, an irrational one, and one which you or I would take if faced with the same set of options. Well, what can be done about this problem? It's clear that there are multiple roots to the underclass problem, and what this suggests is that we're going to have to pursue a number of policies if we hope to have any significant improvement in the future. First and foremost thing that I would do is to begin taking the steps that are needed to strengthen the nation's economy in order to bring the unemployment rate down. As long as sufficient number of jobs are not available, it's unlikely that the members of the underclass, no matter what kind of training and education and other bells and whistles we give them, are going to be able to compete. You know, you're going to have a 9.3% unemployment rate in this state this year, and you have lots of skilled workers out there looking for jobs. It's very hard to see how a young black male with a high school dropout who you then give him a GED degree and some basic training is going to compete with that 35-year-old person who has a 10-year track record of experience in some kind of factory job. They just aren't. To the extent that the underclass is a product of the demographic forces that I discussed, there's really very little that policymakers can do to cure the problem. But it's fortunate that the impact of these forces should begin to abate. The baby boom has turned into the baby bust. By 1995, the youth age cohort, which is entering the labor force each year, will be only 75% as large as it was in 1979, which was the peak year in which baby boomers entered the labor market. With respect to women, everybody expects the labor force participation rate to continue to rise, but it can't rise at anywhere near the rate that it's risen over the last 15 years, or we'll have a rate of over 100% participation by women by the end of the century. With respect to immigrants, it's clear that we're going to be under continued pressure, both from legal and illegal immigrants, but there is some hope that the recent legislation, immigration reform legislation that was enacted last year by the Congress, will do a little more to protect native-born workers in the United States. To the extent that the underclass represents the debris that's been left behind by the rapid structural and economic change that we've experienced, the appropriate policy response is some form of massive investment in human capital. Such a policy would require expanded basic education and training efforts directed at those young adults who are now not part of the mainstream economy. For the younger age groups, such a policy should emphasize the mastery of basic skills in schools and efforts to reduce high school dropout rates, and possibly the development of quality alternatives to academically oriented post-secondary schools. This is something which other nations have been much more successful with than the United States. To the extent that the pathology of the modern ghetto lies behind the emergence of the underclass, the policy response could really go in one of two directions. The first would be to offer the disadvantaged ghetto residents a chance to escape from the environment that they're trapped in now. One option here would be housing vouchers, which the residents of these areas could use, but could use only in areas that did not have high concentrations of low-income people. Another option in this regard would be open enrollment plans that would say to the children who reside in those areas that they would have a priority right to attend any public school that they could get themselves to in the metropolitan area. Second approach that one might take in this area would be an attempt to revitalize the economy and social structures of the ghetto. We've tried this a lot in the past, and we've been, I think, almost uniformly unsuccessful, but we could always try again. There have been suggestions by the National Governors Association that ghetto schools that fail could be taken over, put in receivership, and run by the state. There are all of the proposals for enterprise zones to try and beef up the economic incentives that exist for investment in these areas. More could be done clearly to make the neighborhoods safe from crime. Policies also need to be pursued that will make traditional forms of employment more attractive and alternative lifestyles less desirable. An effort along these lines might include such things as raising the minimum wage, which in the last 6 years has declined about 25% in real terms. Would also include maybe a further expansion of the earned income tax credit, which was changed rather substantially in the tax law of '86, and possibly the extension of adequate health insurance to all workers in America. A large fraction of the low-income workers in America don't have health insurance. Expanded daycare programs, transportation subsidies for low-wage workers, and things like that also could help, as could policies that tied the extended receipt of welfare benefits to participation in some kind of education, training, or work program. And I was interested to see that your state government yesterday put forward a proposal to do exactly this, which is something that the state of New Jersey, the state of New York, and half a dozen other states are, California, Massachusetts, are fairly far down the track towards doing. Let me conclude by emphasizing what is probably the obvious, and that is that this is going to be a long haul. We're a nation that by and large is attracted to the quick fix, to policies that promise an instant solution to difficult problems. The complexity of the underclass problem suggests that this is a dilemma that will not disappear rapidly and will not disappear as a result of a single policy intervention. Any one of the things that I have mentioned as a proposal here would probably make a very small and probably imperceptible difference if done by itself. But I don't think this should be cause for despair or delay. We do have a very serious problem in this country, and what we should do, as you have just done in the vote you took, is resolve ourselves to begin to take steps to cure it in some way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reischauer. We come now to the time for questions from the floor, and our first question will be from our board host today, Dick Hutchison.
Dr. Reischauer, 6 years ago the administration unveiled the new federalism and touted volunteerism as a better way to help those in need. How effective will charitable volunteerism be in turning around problems of the underclass?
I think volunteerism has an extremely important role to play, but a role that should supplement the obligation that government has towards its citizenry. Voluntary organizations, as has been shown by a lot of research that's gone on in that 6-year period, it turns out enlisted the work and knowledge and spirit of many volunteers, but at the same time were heavily dependent on state, local, and federal resources that we do not in this country really have a situation in which we have a pure voluntary sector that accepts no money from government, and a pure government sector that operates on its own, in a business sector in the middle. These three sectors are really interwoven and swapping resources and financial and human all the time. And I think what we need is a cooperative effort that everyone puts their shoulder to the wheel.
For additional questions, please use the microphone so that the radio audience can hear the question. And questions are limited, of course, to members of the City Club.
Ted Fall, Human Services Committee. Mr. Reischauer, as you've just witnessed, the City Club has endorsed the idea that the human services policy of the state of Oregon ought to be guided by an assessment of needs. I wonder if you have any comment, particularly from your perspective as an economist, on how that assessment of needs could be accomplished.
I don't think that's a determination that I, as a citizen of America, would leave up to an economist. Need is relative. Need is a value statement. Need is something that all of us as members of society should participate in the determination of. And you know, it's something that our concept of has changed rather radically over the last 30 years, and my hope is that it will change over the next 30 as well.
Could I just supplement my question by saying that, assuming one had a definition of needs, how would you go about measuring the number of needy people?
Well, it's a terribly difficult problem, as you are well aware, because need is not determined solely, or the fulfilling of need, by monetary resources. There's all sorts of other inputs that one has to add together, and in many ways these are unmeasurable. And people, as you know, have different resources that they can rely on. Some people have family resources, some people have neighborhood resources, some people have church resources and ways of help. And while an objective economist's measure of their need might be the same, in fact, the people, one person you would look at has no need. You have the issue of all of the problems we have with our current measure of poverty. It's a cash income concept. It says how much cash income came into your family during the last 12-month period from working, Social Security, welfare payments, interest, dividend, whatever. It takes no account of many things like assets. One person could have a home that was entirely paid off, and yet had a lower income than another family who had to pay rent. We would count those families as equal to the one with the lower income but with the house, and yet it wouldn't be as needy. So one has to look at the assets of a family, or the consuming unit. We also divide ourselves up into consuming units based on how much resources we have, and that's a very difficult thing too. You look at the data, and one of the great advances of the last 50 years has been the fact that the elderly now don't live with their children. This has been out of choice. If we moved them back in with their children, we would find virtually none of them were poor, probably, or a very small fraction of them were poor. So you get into these kinds of difficult dilemmas when you're trying to measure need.
John O'Brien, member. In noting the dilemma of the underclass, I noticed you didn't mention anything about an overclass.
I didn't want to offend those of you in this room.
I wondered, given the fact that some people believe that the upper classes benefit to some degree by the current arrangements in society and therefore probably endorse a lot of its structures, what, if anything, you have in mind to change that ideological commitment that might give the leadership necessary for your changes.
Well, I'm not a believer that the underclass or the low-wage structure in this country exists because in some sense it benefits the capitalists or the people at the top. I think that kind of conspiratorial thinking is just dead wrong. I think on the whole, our society, rich and poor, suffers and loses in the long run and in the short run from the existence of the underclass and the lost product that's involved there. We have gone through a period of history which has not been a good one economically for the average American, but in fact has been a pretty darn good one for people like ourselves, for the educated chunk of society. While wages and incomes in general have either stagnated over the last 10 to 15 years, they have gone up at a fairly healthy clip for those of us in the upper middle class, as it's euphemistically called. And I think the answer is that in the long run, if we want to solve some of these social problems, we're going to have to dig deeper into our pockets for more taxes.
Dale Annis, City Club member. Clearly, an underclass is not unique to this country. It exists in other countries. Has anything been done elsewhere that we can learn from?
Well, I don't think that's altogether accurate. If you look at the data that's available from many of the Western European countries, the Scandinavian countries, West Germany, France, it doesn't seem to be the case. Where you are right, I think, is in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in Great Britain, where very high rates of unemployment have begun to produce the same kinds of pathologies that we're finding in the United States. And by and large, they're as perplexed about the situation as we are, but the difference is that they have a social safety net that's a good deal further off the ground than ours is. And so while they do have this problem, the human misery that results from it is less.
Jane Bloom, if the Reagan administration had its way, there would be more money appropriated for defense, no new taxes, and more cuts in domestic spending, i.e. social programs. But the Democrats control the Congress, and there's talk of catastrophic health insurance. What do you see happening in Washington in the next 2 years?
Very little. You've put your finger on the problem. We have a huge deficit, which everybody agrees we should do something about. And I hope those of you who watched the State of the Union address caught the irony when we had a president who has presided over almost a tripling of the federal debt and the largest 5 or 6 deficits the country has ever witnessed, saying that the deficits in this country were absolutely intolerable, at which point 535 members of Congress who have been unable to deal with this problem leapt to their feet and began to cheer. There was a touch of black humor about this. We have a president who's very popular and has very strong ideas about how the deficit should be dealt with, and you've described them very well. We have a Congress, both Republican and Democrat, that think the solution is going to involve a substantial contribution from increased taxes, but given their political vulnerability, are incapable of stepping out front on that issue. And as long as that remains the situation, I see that we will have stalemate.
Marilyn McDonald Smith, member of the City Club. My sympathies are certainly with the underclass, the poor. How do you view the phenomenon, especially in this state, with so many closures, layoffs, the fallen middle class, perhaps, that class of people who has reached a standard of living but can no longer maintain that standard of living? How do they fit into the economist's view of the future, and how can some of these things be resolved?
The situation that you're experiencing here, I think in large measure is due to the fiscal mismanagement at the national level, which has not only kept the overall rate of growth of the economy slow, but has led to a way overvalued dollar, which has then caused some very rapid structural changes in our economy. Kinds of changes that probably were inevitable, but we would have experienced them over a 30 or 40-year period. We condensed and collapsed into a 10-year period, and it's led to some very difficult times here and in the Rust Belt and in even in Texas now. We'll weather this. There will be an adjustment once we get the deficit in some kind of tolerable shape. We should see some lower interest rates, real interest rates in this country, and a return to a more normal pattern of economic growth, and those middle-class people who have suffered so much should be first in line to benefit from that. That's not a whole lot of solace to give anybody to say you'll be fine when the deficit's solved after we've sat around for 6 years and not solved it. And a lot of what's going to be involved is probably continued geographic mobility of the population. And I would guess that the state of Oregon can't go on many years with a 9% unemployment rate when the state of Massachusetts has a 3.5% one, and the state of Connecticut and New Hampshire both have rates under 4%, without there being some people getting on the plane with me and going back to these areas of the country. That has been the American way. It's a big price to pay, but it's out there.
I think we'll have time for just one more question.
Mary Radke Klein, member of the City Club. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what might be necessary to change public opinion, to galvanize public opinion, to give us the kind of political and public opinion will to do something about these problems. I think that many of us have sat in committees and conferences and places like this and talked about the same problems, and yet for some reason there doesn't seem to exist the kind of public will to make changes. Thank you.
Well, I think the lack of public will stems from two things. One is a general perception that we threw a lot of money at these problems in the 1960s and it didn't do anything. I think that's basically a wrong conclusion. If you look at the data, and a number of people have, the fact is that a number of these programs worked and worked quite well, and that was the reason why we cut the numbers, the poverty rate in this country between 1960 and 1973 fell in half from 22 to 11%. Part of it was the strong performance of the economy, but part of it was the effect of the programs. Since 1973, a lot of our basic programs have been eroded rather substantially by inflation, and as a result, they haven't done as much. I think we can turn that perception around, but that will be a slow task. The other thing that has led to a lack of enthusiasm, I think, and I apologize for sounding like a broken record here, is the performance of the economy and the average person in America. The average person in America over the last 10 years hasn't done very well themselves. And in that kind of situation, you think first about yourself, your family. One way you get an increase in your standard of living when your wages aren't rising as fast as inflation, which they haven't for most Americans over the last decade, is you give yourself a tax cut. And your disposable income then rises. Until we get the economy back on track, I don't expect that there'll be a great outpouring of interest in these types of, in devoting a lot more resources to these types of efforts. I think the American people are extremely generous when they feel secure themselves. But if they're sitting in the state of Oregon and looking around themselves and saying, hey, 1 out of 10 of my fellow Oregonians is unemployed and it could be me, they aren't going to spend as much of their energy worrying about the other guy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reischauer. We appreciate your being with us today for a very thorough and interesting presentation. Remember, next week we go on to economic development, and we are now adjourned.
Thanks. Hard to believe it.